Hey everyone, welcome back to Brainstorm. This is Python for NCEA. Now in this video we're going to take a look at while loops. But before we can do that, we better go over the motivation for why we would want to use loops in the first place. So I guess let's start off by creating a variable called, let's call it brainstorm, and let's store the string brainstorm. Now let's say I had a situation where I wanted to print each individual character on its own line. So using the techniques that we've learned, and we want to print each individual index or each individual character at every index, we would have to go print brainstorm, and we want to take the first index, which is actually at index 0, and then I would continuously do this for the entire length of the string, going 0, 1, 2, and 3, and so on and so forth. So if I run that there, we get BRAI, and then we'd have to do the rest, right? Now, the thing is, what if I also wanted to change this string here, right? Let's say I then changed it to hi. Well, now this code is going to produce an error because we don't know exactly the length of the input at any given time, right? So if I try to run this has only got two indexes, 0 and 1, but we're running through 2 and 3, which don't exist, right? So here you can see we get a string out of range index 0. Right, so wouldn't it be quite useful if we could have something that would automatically run through every single character in our string and print it on a new line, right? So the idea, right, behind loops is that whenever we have a repetitive task, we can automate that and make it more efficient and useful for us, right? So that really helps us with, especially variables where things are changing. Loops will help us. Essentially loop through variable things, right? So let's take a look at how while loops are structured. So essentially we use the keyword while, and then we say we have a condition here. So we're going to have a condition here. And while this condition is true, we use the semicolon and then click enter, and whatever we write in this indent here is going to execute while that condition is true. So we're going to do something in here. So it's a little bit like if statements here. So if something is true, we do something, but for a while loop, we continue to do it until that condition is now false, right? So I hope you can see that if we do something and then we don't do anything to change this condition up here, the loop actually runs forever, right? And we'll take a look at that in a second, right? So let's take a look at this scenario here where we want to print the numbers 1 to 10 inclusive, and let's use a while loop to do that. So, just to clarify as well, I'll call this part, so anything before and including this while statement, I'll call it the setup, and then anything that's indented, I'm going to call that the body of the loop. So essentially we want to say we need to do some setup first, right? So let's delete that. So first of all, we're going to need some kind of counter or some kind of step that's going to tell my while loop, hey, we want to count from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and so on and so forth up to 10. Sorry, that should be from 1 to 2, not from 0. So I'm going to create a variable called counter, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. So this is all part of my setup. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm then going to initiate my while loop. So I'm going to say while my counter is less than or equal to 10. And what do I want to do? Well, what we want to do is we want to print the value of counter. Okay, and then okay, let's see what happens if I do this. Now, okay, we're starting from 0, so it's going to essentially start with the number 0, right? So if I click F5, you can see that it continuously spams my auto shell with the number 0. So I've clearly, I'm clearly looping, right? But it's not stopping. So what's the problem here? Well, first of all, we better change our counter to start from 1 since we wanted to start from 1 to 10. So counter is equal to 1, but now if I run the idle shell, you can see it continuously runs printing that number 1 on a new line. So how do we go around fixing that? Well, essentially, we need to continuously change our counter variable each time we do what we call an iteration of the loop, or each time we run the body of that loop. So essentially what we're going to do is each time we print counter, we will then want to increment counter by 1. So we want to add 1 to counter. So what we're going to do is we're going to go counter plus equal 1. Right, so what this is going to do essentially is it starts at 1 while the counter is less than or equal to 10. Is 1 less than or equal to 10? Yes, it is. So print that number. So print 1, then add 1 to it. So the counter value is now going to be 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 10? Yes, it is. So print counter, so print 2, and then add 1 to it. So it's going to get to 3. Then we're going to print 3, counter becomes 4. Then we print 4, print 5, print 6, print 7, print 8, print 9. Then we get to 10. We print 10, then we add 1 to the counter. Now counter is 11. Is 11 less than or equal to 10? The answer is no. So what it's going to do is it's going to stop running the while loop, and it's going to move on to the next line after that while loop is complete. Right, so it's going to move on here, but since we don't have anything, it's going to end the program. So if I save this and click F5, hopefully you can see that it's incremented, it's printed the numbers 1 to 10 in the idle shell, line by line. Alright, let's look at an example using strings now. So for example, let's say we want to ask the user to enter a string. So let's call the variable user string, and that's equal to the input. Please enter a string. Now, whatever string they enter, what we want to do is we want to loop through that string and print each character on a new line. So how are we going to go about doing that? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to begin our setup. So everything that's going to happen before what we want to repeat. So what do we need to do? Well, to be honest, this is going to make us or give us our string that we need. So what we can do then is now initialize our while loop. So what we're going to say is, and there's plenty of ways to do this. I'm trying to think. I'll show you 2 ways, in fact. So the first way we're going to do is we're just going to continuously remove characters from our user string until the string is empty. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say while the length of the user string is greater than 0. What do we want to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to print the first index of the user string. So user string, we're going to use our rectangular brackets and grab the first index, the first character, which is at the index at position 0, or index 0. So when we print this, if I was just to use this as a loop right now, so if I save this and click F5 and I enter the string hi, it's going to spam my idle shell with the letter H, as you can see. So what we need to do is we need to include something that's going to change this value up here, right? So what can that be? Well, essentially, we need to do something so that the length of the user string gets closer and closer and smaller to eventually hit 0, so we stop our while loop. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to set the user string to be equal to the user string currently, and then we're going to make the user string, we're going to take a slice from the first index until the end, right? So we're going to not include that index that we've just printed. Okay, so if we had the string hi, what this is going to do is it's going to say, well, my string has a length of 2. So is the length of the string greater than 0? Yes, it is. Let's print that first index, which is h, and then let's make the user string a slice. So from all the letters, not including the letter we just printed, which is going to leave I left over. Now user string is exactly the length of 1. 1 is greater than 0. So let's print the first index, which is just I. Now user string is equal to all the characters after that, which is none. So our user string now has a length of 0. So is the user string greater than, the length of the user string greater than 0? No, it's not. So our while loop ends and we come down here. So let's try that now. Let's save that and click F5. We get please enter a string. Let's enter the string hi, and it prints H and I on different lines. We can try a different string. Let's try the string Brainstorm New Zealand. And as you can see, it prints everything, including those spaces, on separate lines, right? So this is a super efficient way to carry out applications, right? So obviously these are a little bit boring examples, but once we move on to things like lists and dictionaries and even classes, we're going to see that while loops, and particularly for loops, are very powerful tools. Now, I said that we could have done this a slightly different way. So of course there's different ways to write your while loops, and we can achieve the same thing. This time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a counter and use the counter as the index position, and then while the counter is then less than the length of that string, let's continuously print the index at that counter position. So let's comment this out here. Let's set up. So let's create a counter. Let's set it equal to 0. So this is starting at index 0. What we want to say is while the counter is less than, and remember that our indexes for any string, if you recall, go from 0 to the length of the string minus 1. So what we want to say is while the counter is less than the length of the user string, well, what do we want to do? Well, what we want to do is we want to print the user string at index counter, and then what we want to do is we want to increment that counter by 1. So counter plus or equal 1, and if I've done that correctly, it should hopefully print the whole string. If not, we're going to see an index error, and we're going to look at how to fix that. So let's save that and click F5. Please enter a string. Let's type hi, and as you can see, it prints hi correctly. Now, if I was to say counter is less than or equal to the length of the string, we're going to get an index error. The reason for that is essentially remember that our index stops at the length of the string minus 1. So essentially, let's say we still had that string hi. We're at index 1 now. We print that letter I. We increment the counter to 2. Now, is 2 less than or equal to the length of our string? Now, the length of our string is 2, so the answer is that's true. So then it's going to try and print the user string, or the index 2 for the string user string, and well, 0, 1, and then there's nothing at index 2, so this is going to give me an index error. So let's save that and click F5. Let's enter the string hi, and as you can see, we get an index error because it's out of the applicable range for our letters. So that's why we're doing less than the length of the user string. So if I save that, and if I type in hi now, you can see it prints just fine. Alright, let's move on to our application questions, and what you're going to see is that our application questions are going to get a little bit harder and harder each time. Alright, so for question 1, write a program which prompts the user to enter a number. Store the number in a variable called iterations. Print line x, my first while loop, exactly iterations times, where x is equal to the value of the count. You must use a while loop to answer the question. So pause the video, have a go, and then we'll go through the program. Alright, so what do we want to do? Well, first we want to prompt the user to enter a number. So user num, actually we need to store in a variable called iterations, sorry. So the iterations is equal to the integer input. Please enter a number. Now, whatever number they've entered, we want to print that exactly iterations times. So if they put 20 in, we want to print 20 times my first while loop and the line, or the number of times that's been done essentially. So what we want to do is we want to say while, so we need to do our setup, right? So if we think about it, we need to essentially have some kind of counter which counts up until that value of iterations. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a counter variable called counter, set it equal to 0, and then we're going to write our while statement. So while, and then what's the statement that we want to run while it's true? Well, we want to say while the counter is less than the number of iterations, what do we want to do? Well, what we want to do is we want to print line, and then we want to print the line number, which is the same as the value of counter. So we're going to put some curly braces there for now. Then we're going to write my first while loop with an exclamation mark. We need to use dot format, and we're going to put in the value of counter. Now, we're not done yet. After that, what we need to do is we need to increment our counter by 1 so that this value is always changing. So counter plus or equal 1. Now, if I save that and click F5, please enter a number. Let's enter the number 20, and as you can see, it prints the same output as the suggested output. So that seems to loop through just fine. Now, what would happen if I put counter is less than or equal to the number of iterations? Well, now, because we're going from 0 up until and including the number of iterations, this will run exactly 21 times, right? So this ran 20 times because we went from 0 to 19, that's actually 20. But now if we went from 0 to 20, that's 21 times. And so if I save that and click F5, and I run it 20 times, you can see that it prints 21 lines, but our line number started from 0, so that's actually 21. Okay, so that's why we went to counter less than iteration. So if I run this now, it loops through exactly 20 times. All right, let's get into it then. So we've got the string here, which says that's just the wave, and we've got all these ats here. So what we need to do first is we need to do our setup. So we want to loop through every character in our string. So we could have used either method of removing each character one by one in the string, or we could just create a counter variable or an index variable and count each index while it is less than the length of the string. So I'm going to do that second option. So let's create our setup. So what do we actually want to do in the equation? We want to continuously add something to a counter, all right? So what we need to do is we need to have a counter variable. So counter is equal to 0. And we also want that index variable, which is going to tell us what index we're currently at. So index is equal to 0. What we're going to do next is we're going to initialize our while loop. So while the index, so whatever index we're at, is less than the length of my string, because remember our strings have indexes from 0 to length minus 1. So while the index is less than the length of my string, what do we want to do? Well, we want to check what character is at that index and check if it's an @ symbol. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, let's take my string. Let's jump to the index given at position index. So initially it's going to be my string at index 0. And what we want to do is we want to check if it's an @ character. So we want to say if the character at this index is equal to the @ symbol. And what do we want to do? Well, if it is, we want to add 1 to the counter. So counter plus or equal 1. What happens if it's not? Well, if it's not, we just continue to loop. So we definitely don't need an else statement there. Okay, so what do we want to do after that? Well, what we want to do then is we want to add 1 to our index to keep our index value increasing, and so we don't get stuck in an infinite loop. Okay, so what we're going to do is after that if statement, regardless if it's an @ symbol or not, what we want to do is we want to increment the index by 1. So plus or equal 1. So if I save that and run it now, of course, I need to actually print the counter, right? At the very end. So at the end of the while loop, we want to print the value of counter. So as you can see, once we print it, it prints the value 13. Now let's check the second string about Junior Watanabe. So let's try this here, and hopefully it gives us 3. And as you can see, it does. So it looks like we've done this loop correctly. But I want to show you what would happen if we didn't increment our index by 1. So let's comment that out and let's see what happens. So essentially the index is always going to be index 0 because we're not changing it. So it's going to continuously print J. So if I run this, so it looks like nothing's happening, right? But what's actually happening is it's continuously checking this while loop. So is the index less than less than the length of my string? So is 0 less than the length of my string? Yes, so it's going to perform this, but then the index isn't changing. So if I try and quit it now, you can see that the program is actually still running. Alright, so to make that a little bit more clearer, let's print my string at index 0. So, oh, sorry, I've made a mistake there. Let's not have that indented. So let's just print at the very start. And now if I run it, you can see it just continuously spams unless I include that index value there. If I include this index here, I save it and click F5, now you can see it prints out every single character here. So it successfully loops through every single character. Alright, and let's take a look at the final question, definitely the hardest one. It's about Fibonacci numbers. So the nth Fibonacci number is given by Fn is equal to f of n minus 1 plus f of n minus 2. We want to write a program which calculates the nth Fibonacci number. So you should first prompt the user to enter a value for n, and the first 3 Fibonacci numbers are 1, 1, and 2, and you have to use a while loop to answer the question. So for example, if I gave you the value 1, it prints 1. If I give you the value 130, it prints this here. So have a think about how you might do it, and then have a look at how I would do it. Alright, so I will bring up Paint here to try and give an explanation of what's happening. So we know the first 3 Fibonacci numbers, 1, 1, and 2. So how does the Fibonacci sequence work? Well, as you can see, it's Fn is equal to the latest Fibonacci number plus the second latest Fibonacci number. So for example, 1 plus 1 gives 2. 1 plus 2 gives 3. So the fourth Fibonacci is 3. 2 plus 3 gives 5. So the fifth Fibonacci number is 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. 8 plus 5 is 13, I think. Right. So these are our first 7 Fibonacci numbers. So what was happening when we were trying to calculate our Fibonacci numbers? Let's take the Fibonacci number 6, for example. So how do we calculate it? We need to know the previous 2 fib numbers, right? So we needed to know 4 and 5. So which one is Fn minus 2? It's the least recent one, right, which is number 4. Okay, so we're going to put 3 in there. We then take the latest one, which was 5. We're going to put 5 as the latest one. The second latest one was 3. And then Fn is the sum of these two numbers, so 5 plus 3, which was 8, right? So now what would happen, so I've got 8 now, and I now want to calculate the 7th one. So what would I do next? Well, now, essentially, this number has become the second latest, and this number has become the latest. So what we need to do, we need to take this number, move it into Fn minus 2. Then we're going to take this number and move it into Fn minus 1. And once we've done that, so now we're going to do 5 plus 8, and that's going to equal 13 as the value in Fn. Right? And then what we're going to have to do is then move this value back and move that value back. Alright, so let's code it. So write a program which calculates it. So first, let's prompt the user to enter an integer n. So user num is equal to int input. Please enter a number. So they're going to enter their number, and then what we want to do is we want to use a while loop to calculate the nth Fibonacci number. So we already know the values of the first 3. To be honest, I think we only need the first 2 numbers. So first fib is equal to 1. In fact, we don't even need to specify these. We can use if statements to do so. So if user num is equal to 1, then we're just going to return 1, right? Because that's the first Fibonacci number, and we already know that. So print 1. Else, if the user number is equal to 2, we're going to print 1 as well, because the first 2 Fibonacci numbers are 1 and 1. If it's not either of those, what do we want to do? Well, now we want to run a while loop, right? So what's the while loop going to be? The while loop is going to be while, and I guess we will need some kind of counter. So let's set up our counter here. So counter is going to equal, and what's the counter going to start at? Well, it's going to have to start at the number, not 1, not 2, but 3, right? Because if it's 1 or 2, we've already found the value. So starting at the value 3, so counter is equal to 3, while the counter is less than the user num. What do we want to do? Well, what we want to do is we first want to calculate the newest Fibonacci number. So we're going to call it the newest fib is equal to the value, the newest fib is going to be equal to the latest fib added with the second, and we don't start variables with numbers, so second latest fib. Right, so we haven't actually specified these variables in our program, so we need to do that. So remember, we're going to start with the base case that the count is 3, right? So what's the latest fib right now? So at the very beginning, the latest fib is 1, and the second latest fib is also 1, right? Because for the third fib number, we're doing 1 plus 1, which equals 2. So the first and the second fib numbers are 1 and 1. So newest fib is 1 plus 1, which is 2. Then if you remember what I did on Paint, what we did was we moved the latest fib into the second latest fib, and then we moved the newest fib into the latest fib. So our second latest fib needs to be updated to become the latest fib. So whatever the value in latest fib was, let's make it now the second latest fib. Whatever the value in latest fib was, let's make it the value in the newest fib. Alright, and then what do we need to do? We need to increment our counter by 1. And then let's print the newest fib once the while loop has ended. Alright. So hopefully I've done something correctly. If not, we'll try to debug it. So enter a number. Let's enter the number 1. And it says the newest fib is not defined. Of course, right? Because we need to have this inside the else statement. Sorry. So let's try and run it again. Let's get 1. So if the number is 1, we print 1. Let's run it again. If the number is 2, we print 1. If the number is now 3, okay, we've got another error. Newest fib is not defined. Alright guys, sorry about that. So the error that I made was that if you remember, so if I run this here and then I try and enter a number, it says that the newest fib wasn't defined. That's because we remember that in our setup we need to include all the variables, and as you can see, newest fib is not specified before our while loop here, so that was a bit of a silly mistake from me. So let's specify the newest fib, and let's just set the initial value to be 0. Okay, so now let's try and run it and see what happens. So if we run it and we put in the number 3, okay, well now we're getting an output of 0, and the third Fibonacci is 2. So what mistake are we making? Well, usually if we get mistakes like this, the first thing we want to check is our while statement. So while the counter is less than the user num. So in this situation, our number is 3. And our counter is actually starting at 3. Is 3 less than 3? The answer is no, it's false. So it's just going to print 0, which is the initial value of our newest fib. So if I set this value to 550, we'll get 550 here, right? So how do we fix this? Well, what we want to say is while the counter is less than or equal to the user num. Okay, so counter is equal, this is true, this runs, the counter becomes 4, 4 is greater than 3, so it'll stop. So that should work now. So if we save this and click F5, please enter a number. Let's enter the number 3, and as you can see, it prints out 2. Now let's try the number 130, and hopefully, if I've done everything right, we get the same number, and it looks like it is the same number there. Awesome guys, thanks for checking out this video on while loops. I know this question was a bit of a tricky one there. I definitely wouldn't expect then expect this kind of difficulty in NCEA. But I wanted to show you how powerful while loops really are, right? So it would take us ages to calculate this Fibonacci number by hand, but our computer was able to do it in less than a second, right? So I think that's a really powerful thing. Leave a like and see you guys in the next video. Cheers.